to our first event of the year, From Blood to DNA, From Tribe to Race, Science, Whiteness, and Property. And our event is co-sponsored by the Department of Sociology and the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. So before we begin, I have two announcements. We invite UC Berkeley graduate and undergraduate students to apply for small grants to assist with the development of student research projects on issues facing Native American communities in the U.S. today. The deadline for submitting applications is Friday, October 21st, and the application and more information is on our website. On Thursday, December 1st, we will host James Ramos, chairman of the San Manuel Band of the Serrano Mission Indians. The event will be from noon to 1:30. We don't have a room yet, but if you give us your email address, we will let you know where the room will be. And there is a sign-up sheet going around. If you haven't signed in, please do so. You don't have to give us your email address, but we would like you to sign in so we can say that lots of people are interested in our events. If you could please turn off your cell phones or make sure that they're not going to make any noise. So today, Professor TallBear will speak for about 45 minutes, and then Professor Duster will have about 10 minutes to respond. And then we'll open up the conversation to questions and discussion from everyone. I'm happy to introduce Kimberly TallBear. She's an assistant professor of environmental science, policy, and management here at UC Berkeley. Her research and teaching cross the fields of science and technology studies, feminist science studies, anthropology of science, cultural studies, and Native American studies. She focuses on the culture and politics of genomic, forensic, and environmental science and technology as they intersect with U.S. American conceptions of race and nation. She has published numerous academic articles and chapters on race, identity, and DNA, and she is also the co-editor of a book for general audiences, This Stretch of the River, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota Responses to the Lewis and Clark Expedition and Bicentennial. She is an enrolled member of the
Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate.
Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate in South Dakota. And after we hear from Professor TallBear, we'll hear from Troy Duster, who is Silver Professor of Sociology and Director of the Institute for the History of the Production of Knowledge at New York University. He is also the Chancellor's Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and the founder of the ancestor of our institute here. Duster's research and writing have ranged across a variety of subject areas: the sociology of law, science, deviance, inequality, race, and education. In 1970, his first book, The Legislation of Morality, Drugs, Crime, and Law, became a classic in the drug field. He's also the co-author of Whitewashing Race, The Myth of the Colorblind Society. And his book, Backdoor to Eugenics, is one of the first academic books to explore genetic testing from a sociological perspective.
Thank you. It's great to have a diverse audience. I know you're diverse because I don't know most of you. I know people in ESPM and Native American Studies, a little bit gender and women's studies, so I don't know a lot of you who are here. I just gave a version of this talk yesterday in a bioethics class at Santa Cruz. I gave a version of this talk 3 weeks ago at the National Museum of the American Indian on a panel on blood quantum, where I was the only one not talking primarily about blood quantum. So I speak to Native studies audiences, bioethics audiences, science and technology studies, and I'm always sort of reeling from trying to figure out what kind of narrative line I can go through my talks for the particular audience I'm speaking to. This is really dense, complicated material, and I will do the best job that I can. I'm very excited about this kind of stuff, and I hope you will be too. And I hope I tell you a good story today. I also just want to briefly thank Troy Duster for being my discussant. I am not young, but I'm youngish. So, I turned 42 last week, so I can't claim to be so young. Yeah, it's great. I love these things. You're not clueless like in your 20s, but your cells still renew themselves fairly well. But it's a little intimidating to have somebody of Troy Duster's preeminence. Troy is, as some of you may know, and if you don't know, he is one of the major scholars of race and genetics in the country, and all of us in my generation, as far as the ones I know, we totally look up to him, and he teaches us a lot. And he's a great mentor, too. So whatever he has to throw my way, whether it's supportive or critical, I totally take with respect and admiration. I'm really grateful that he's going to have some feedback for me. So that said, let's get started. So I'm going to talk about these two objects, blood and DNA. Both scientific objects, both metaphorical objects. And I'm going to talk about the transition from blood to DNA, and then from tribe to race, and maybe back to tribe, in the context of Native American tribal enrollment and identity. And I'm going to relate all of this to this assertion that I and my co-author Jenny Reardon make, so I need to credit her because part of this talk comes out of a paper that we have coming out in Current Anthropology sometime in the winter or spring called Your DNA is Our History, Genomics and Whiteness is Property. That's the name of the paper, and that paper partly informs this talk. So I basically relate this history of tribe, race, blood, and DNA in relationship to Native American identity to the appropriation of biological and natural resources within the U.S. colonial project. So property claims to biological resources within the context of the U.S. as a developing nation, and how does all of that kind of development and colonization relate to the predicaments we have around Native American race and identity? Okay, that's the larger picture. I hope how that is will become clear as I go through my talk. Two things. You need to understand this narrative that I'm weaving. You need to understand that there are two kinds of bodies of scholarship that are important to keep in mind when thinking about Native American identity issues. The first is federal Indian law and concepts of sovereignty. And you need to understand that those really strongly condition tribal identity in the United States post-contact. The other thing is concepts of race in the United States and histories of racial categories. Quite often in Indian country, when we debate tribal enrollment and identity issues, you get a lot of people who are really committed to tribal sovereignty and self-governance saying tribes are political nations, we are not a race or ethnic category. In part, that's true. That's what tribal enrollment's about. It's about citizenship, and we should not forget that. If what we are concerned with is tribes' abilities and rights to govern their own citizenries, to regulate their environments. On the other hand, you don't get to opt out of being racialized in our heavily racialized country, and so that's also partly not true when tribal sovereignty advocates say that. So what I try to do is think about histories of sovereignty and histories of race and how those articulate and how they sort of push back and shape one another. Because dominant US concepts of race indeed shape what is possible in terms of who gets to claim being Native American, who gets to be a tribe, who gets into a tribe, and then who gets to have access to regulating their environment and citizenry. So you don't do that in a vacuum that's absent race concepts. So we need both race scholarship and we need federal Indian law and policy to understand these issues. This is Cheryl Harris. She's somebody that Jenny Reardon and I, in this paper we have coming out, draw on heavily. She published this important Harvard Law Review article in 1993, Whiteness is Property, and this was she was trying to weigh in on affirmative action debates, and at that point. I distilled the article into three main points that are helpful for the kind of work that I do. And I'll just briefly run over those for you. Cheryl Harris describes the category of whiteness as a form of property that enables those who are able to identify as belonging to that group, so those who have access to that category, to in turn control other forms of property. So the first thing she does is she talks about racial theories that were prominent during the developing years of the United States. Theories like Lewis Henry Morgan's cultural evolution that positioned whites, he called them Americans at the time, so he conflated the term American with white people. And remember, who had access to whiteness in the 19th century is different than who had access today. Not everybody who came from the continent of Europe, or very fewer people who came from Europe had access to that category in the 19th century. So at any rate, people who were positioned as whites or Americans at that time were constructed or viewed as rational agents who were alone capable of transforming nature into productive property. So a lot of property connotations went along with this emerging category of whiteness. Now Native people, or Indians as we were often called and were then, were seen as existing outside of or at an earlier point in civilizational time. So Morgan had this, I have a slide coming up, had these visuals of what cultural evolution looked like. So you had apes on the bottom, and you had prototypical Africans above that, and you might have a Native American above that, slightly more evolved than the African and the ape. And then, of course, whites were on the top, usually represented by some kind of Greek statue. But Native people were seen as existing outside of or at an earlier point in civilizational time. Therefore, they lacked the moral qualities needed to advance civilization by transforming natural resources into productive property or into things of value. So this then helped justify the taking of Native American lands, or for blacks, the appropriation of their bodies and labor. That's her first point. The second point is that Harris argues that whiteness and property became so strongly linked during this time that the category of whiteness became, in effect, a form of property, a form of treasured property that affords those who own it rights and privileges that the American legal system defends. And this is where she was weighing in on affirmative action. The third point, which is really important for the work that I do, is that the privileges accorded to whiteness include the right to control the legal meaning of group identity. So if the privileges of whiteness are going to be reserved for a few, blacks and Native Americans, for example, had to be racialized and subordinated as other in order to give whites, or Americans in Morgan's case, the exclusive right to appropriate natural resources, again including slave bodies and labor, for the development of the U.S. nation. So if you're going to reserve those rights and access to resources for the few, you've got to designate as other a whole bunch of other people that are here. So how does whiteness as property, this concept, influence how we think about Native American DNA? I have one more chair, by the way, if somebody needs it and wants to come.
And there's one.
Two.
Okay. So I use Cheryl Harris, in a sense, to analyze the links between whiteness and property within the biosciences. And the biosciences have come to the fore of the U.S. nation's development strategies in the late 20th and early 21st century. So, let me see, so consider several points. Self-identified Europeans, such as the human population geneticist Spencer Wells, who you'll meet in a few minutes if you're not familiar with him already, argue for access to nature in the form of indigenous people's DNA because they can transform it into something of value and use. So the value that they see in accessing indigenous DNA is we can find our origins, and who constitutes our does not include indigenous people. We'll come to that. Genomics can help end racism. We might perhaps in the long term get cures to diseases from the basic research that we're doing now. So again, we should have the right as scientists to access your DNA because there are benefits for the good of all that can come out of this. Now, these kinds of claims by geneticists imply older conceptions of indigenes as sources of natural resources. Now, this time it's not our lands, but our bodies as DNA repositories. And again, the idea being, as we are represented as anti-science, and you'll see that coming up, that we don't have any similar capacity to transform natural resources into things of value. We are the repositories of biological and natural resources. They, scientists, synonymized with Europeanness, are the ones that have the ability to transform nature into productive property. Now I want to call your attention to an important point, and that's that second bullet point. Whiteness is still associated with European ancestry, but it has also always been about rationality and modernity. So that category has been about rationality and modernity. So what Jenny Reardon and I assert is that the category of whiteness is also now enacted through the subjectivity of the scientist. Basically, that science shares in the privileges of whiteness. So whiteness in this scientific form still figures as a rational civilizing project that creates symbolic and material value that is of use to all humanity, supposedly. So to use Cheryl Harris's analysis, whiteness itself is a thing of value that should be developed and defended. Again, but whiteness attached to rationality, so we have to keep that in mind. That concept now is about being rational and modern, and that is something that we should defend, right? We want to be rational beings. We don't want to be these anti-science, irrational people. We really privilege the tying of science in scientific decision-making, for example, to governance. So this is something, so it's important that you understand that when I talk about whiteness in this presentation, I'm also talking about it as a particular kind of category, not simply tied to Europe. But again, indigenous natural resources are essential to this developmental quest. I just think it's such a powerful visual, this manifest destiny visual. She's got a book and wisdom, and you probably can't see it very well, but there's these Indians on horseback running away from the westward expansion, the covered wagon and the stagecoach, and I don't know if these guys are miners down in the left-hand corner, but the train in the back. So get out of our way, we're expanding, and okay. I want to talk a little bit about red as the property of whiteness. There's a really interesting article written by a scholar named Yael Ben-Zvi. She graduated from Stanford actually, but she teaches at Ben Gurion University in Israel. I don't know how she got interested in histories of Native American race, but it's some fascinating stuff she does. So I want to use what she's doing to think about red, the category red, or Native Americanness as the property of whiteness, and I just need to make a couple of quick comments about what the fields of law and anthropology share, because they're both at play here. So legal concepts of property, as I've already talked about a little bit, and anthropological concepts of human evolution, I referred to Lewis Henry Morgan in 19th century anthropological ideas. Both of these are concerned with connecting individuals or generations within particular groups in order to facilitate the transfer of material and biological properties from the deceased to living members of the same group. So they're really concerned with how do you think about and regulate inheritance. Both fields, law and anthropology, have used race as a conceptual tool to order humans into groups in order to facilitate or understand the transfer of property within group. So through both legal and anthropological discourses of inheritance, you see the privilege of certain racial groups stabilized and these hierarchies made seemingly natural. You'll understand what I mean when I get to some of the next slides. So I want to talk about red in the 19th century racial imaginary. Red was absorbed. The idea, and if you look at Lewis Henry Morgan's work, was and the work of other prominent thinkers during the 19th century, including federal Indian agents and policymakers, so anthropologists and people working within policy systems, were thinking about how you would absorb red or Native Americans into the white body politic. At the same time, though, the black-white binary was solidifying and black people were being permanently excluded, or the idea was that they should be permanently excluded from the nation. And so there were some the basic point to get from this is that Native Americans were racialized very differently in relation to whites than African Americans were racialized. And this has a lot to do with the kinds of resources that they had to offer and how those were going to be appropriated. So think about it. If you want to appropriate slave labor, you need a lot of slaves. That's a good thing, right? A lot more labor to build the nation. If you want to appropriate Native American land, and a key part of your argument is that it's either not very inhabited or they're not doing much with it, you want to have as few Native Americans as possible. And so the way that we get defined is to winnow down our numbers, and the way that African Americans or blacks get defined is to make their numbers larger. And so that has real interesting implications for how those racial categories are defined. Now again, red was understood through this idea of cultural evolutionism, where you had the savage category on the bottom, and that's, so you're looking at the science, you've got the sort of, I don't know what kind of, it's chimp I guess on the bottom, it's a strange picture of a chimp, and then you've got the Negro, again you can't see that above that. Native Americans missing from this schemata, but I inserted this is an image from a book about the history of craniometry. So this is kind of where the anthropologists were conceiving of Native Americans being, you know, somewhere, this is the savage, this is barbarism, and this is civilization. And the idea was that Indians were why they made such interesting research subjects was that Lewis Henry Morgan said something very similar to what human population geneticists say today. He said, they're disappearing, we have to get a handle on their material artifacts and their cultures and their languages. You know, this really drove the development of the discipline of anthropology in the 19th century before they all disappear. But the idea for many people was that if Native people would interbreed with whites, they would be absorbed into that body, and therefore you would have this. There was this phrase that was circulating in the 19th century: "Kill the Indian, save the man," and that's related to this idea that Native Americans were sort of in this middle stage of cultural development. And therefore were more capable of being absorbed into the white body. So again, just to recap, red evolutionarily preceded white. What this did, and this is really interesting for the appropriation of land, was it made Native Americans the vanishing ancestors of white heirs. And this goes back to that concept of law and anthropology both being concerned with the transfer of property. One of Lewis Henry Morgan's preoccupations was sort of appropriating the property rights in Native American cultural patrimony. So he did some really interesting work where he compared the bricks of houses built by Native people in the Southwest to the bricks of Americans. And he said, oh look, the bricks of Native Americans are cruder, but basically they're much more, advanced than these savage groups down here. And so there were these claims being made to Native American people being kind of the earlier cultural ancestors of whites or of Americans, and that helped justify, again, the sort of becoming indigenous or becoming American. This was a real preoccupation of thinkers at the time, this sort of need to differentiate the United States during its developing years from Europe, attempts to make claims to ownership over history here in the Americas. And so Native Americans, our patrimony and sort of iconic images became very useful to whites in constructing a new American identity and history. So the other thing I just want to mention, when I was going through graduate school and trying to figure out how to write about Native American DNA, it's getting better in the last 10 years, but in the race scholarship generally, Native American race is under-theorized. And so it becomes really difficult actually to talk about contemporary problems that we have that are related to race, when what we have to rely on is scholarship that's really been about deconstructing the black-white binary. And that's all really interesting, important work, but it doesn't completely help you think about how race has, how Native American race has been constructed in ways that enable the appropriation of land. So it's partly what I and others are trying to do in the last 10 years, I think, is do more of that work and contribute to the race scholarship in that way. So just to illustrate how some of these 19th century ideas still persist in anthropology and genetics. I mean, this is also, I should say something really interesting. This is Spencer Wells. He's the principal investigator for the Genographic Project, and I pick on them because he just has these really pithy quotes that sort of capture some of the problems that are also present within the academic science. I interview a lot of academic scientists, and many of them think the Genographic Project is not, up to snuff, so I don't want to group them all together. But a lot of the quotes that I pull out of the genographic literature and films and videos really do reflect some of the problems that also inhere in the more academic work. So I'm picking on him a little bit, but he has such great sound bites. So, but the other thing I was going to mention is Spencer Wells was trained as a geneticist, as a human population geneticist. He was not trained in anthropology, and so there are genetic techniques that are being increasingly used within anthropology departments, or not at Berkeley because we don't have biological anthropology in our anthro department here. But in many other universities where they still have four-field anthropology, they've got genetics going on in their anthropology departments, and I will say, sometimes it's hard to figure out, what am I trying to say here? I hang out with a lot of anthropologists, biological anthropologists, and they may be guilty of some of the same stuff, but one of the things I've noticed is that being trained in an anthropology department and using genetic techniques sometimes helps you be a little bit more attuned to these histories of race and what has gone wrong in anthropology in the 19th century. I find less consciousness about that. Maybe Trevor has something to say. Among geneticists who have not actually been trained in four-field anthropology. So again, some of the scientists that I interview and talk about, they're in anthropology departments or they're in genetics departments, and they tend to sort of move using some of the same kinds of discourses about race, but I see a little bit more attention to being critical to histories of disciplines and race within anthropology. I guess that's the point I want to make. But to get back to the sort of how do 19th century ideas persist today, this is a quote by Spencer Wells, basically saying the same thing that Lewis Henry Morgan was saying in the 19th century, that naturalists have been saying since the 17th century. So you can read along. He's talking about the very special people that they want to trace to find our origins. And our doesn't include those people. So ideally, they would be living in the same place as their ancestors did centuries ago. They should have been relatively isolated from immigration from surrounding groups who have moved into the region recently. They should also retain some of their ancestors' ways of life, be it language, marriage patterns, or other cultural attributes. In other words, what we want are indigenous people. So that's his definition of indigenous people. Isolated, traditional. One of the other words, in parts of the world where indigenous doesn't work very well, they would use the term traditional people, because indigeneity is not an easy thing perhaps to talk about in parts of Africa or Asia like it is here. One of the other things to know is, if you're not familiar with how sampling occurs, these kinds of outward cultural attributes are important. But it's also, the ideal is that you go into a community, a tribal or traditional community, to sample, and you find somebody who all four of their grandparents came from that community. There's an effort here to make a traditional or tribal or indigenous community a genetic population. And we all know, right, those of us who have belonged to traditional communities or work with communities like that know that groups change over time, their boundaries are permeable, people marry in and marry out, groups migrate around the place. A tribe or a traditional group is not synonymous with a genetic population, but there are efforts in the way that sampling occurs to make those two things synonymous. Outward cultural appearances go into that. Questions about one's genealogy go into that. So for example, I've actually seen scientific papers published using Sisseton-Wahpeton samples. That's my tribe. Well, that's a very interesting, I wonder how they did that. Everybody I know in my tribe has ancestors in multiple tribal groups. We had boarding schools, we had relocation, we had termination. I have a great-grandmother from Turtle Mountain, Chippewa, but actually was originally Cree from Saskatchewan, but got enrolled there. I've got a grandfather from Cheyenne, Arapaho. My sister-in-law's Choctaw, Lakota, Dakota. We all of us from Indian country, we all have families like this. This is not unusual. So how you begin to sample a Sisseton-Wahpeton people is really interesting. So there are multiple factors that sort of go into how geneticists are thinking about the kinds of people that they need to sample. But one of the main ones being, we are quickly vanishing. Therefore, get in there and get our blood really quickly. This is Spencer Wells again, speaking about DNA trails. And again, those arrows going across the continents are actually showing the movement of genetic markers out of Africa, partly up into Europe, down through southern Asia, up into Asia, down into Australia. So it's a map that's showing how genetic analysis is being used to trace the history of human migrations out of Africa and around the world. Spencer Wells is characterizing this way of telling genealogical history as a European songline. And I pulled this out of a film that PBS made back in 2003, The Journey of Man. There's a scene where he's sitting talking to an Aboriginal artist in Australia. And he's making this claim about DNA stories really being European stories. Characterizing himself as a European, but he's an American actually. So using that as a racial designation, what I'd like you to think about, he says to this Aboriginal artist who's resistant to having their DNA taken to do human migrations research. The Aboriginal artist says, we're from here, we've always been from here. And Spencer Wells is saying to him, well, what I'd like you to think about with the DNA stories we're telling is that they are DNA stories. It's our version as Europeans of how the world was populated and where we all trace back to. That's our song line. So conflating genetics with Europeanness. We use science to tell us about that because we don't have the sense of direct continuity. Our ancestors didn't pass down the stories. We've lost them and we have to go out and find them. So we use science, which is a European way of looking at the world, to do that. You guys don't need that. So Greg Singh, the Aboriginal artist, is really resistant to this. What often doesn't come out, and when I speak at sort of Native American health research conferences and when I speak to tribal communities, one of the things I say is, look, we've got to do a better job of talking about what bothers us with human migrations research, because the dominant narrative out there in scientific communities, and this is really in their interest, is to say they're anti-science. They have tradition and culture and we have science, and the best we can do is just agree to disagree. And we'll have this multicultural world in which we each have our sets of beliefs. But what's happening here is we can't just agree to disagree, because Spencer Wells is making a plea. I need your DNA, I need your biological resource in order to trace my genealogy, in order to know who I am, and if you withhold that from me, you're withholding my ability to develop psychically, my ability to develop institutions and a scientific field. I need your DNA or I can't provide all this greater good for the world. And that was the same kind of discourse that was happening in the 19th century. This is for the greater good of the nation, for the greater good of the world. Back then, we had a lot more Judeo-Christian kind of ethic informing the civilizational project. Today, that's not really legit anymore in nation building. We've got a much stronger sort of separation of church and state. Science is what's entangled and wed to the state. Science is a mark of civilization, and again, indigenous people must provide the raw materials in order for that kind of development to happen. But he's making this plea. Also, there's something really 19th century about this, but it's coupled with 20th century multiculturalism, and that's why it's kind of hard to see the sort of way that older colonial ideas inform contemporary genetics, because they're coupled with 20th century multiculturalist rhetoric as well, and it's hard to tease these things apart. Our discourses seem a little bit more complicated today. So this is the Havasupai. I'll give you a bit of, how many of you, raise your hands, know something about the Havasupai case? Okay. It's always well under half, and this just occupies, like, for a couple of years, 50% of my thinking. I'm surprised that people don't know about this. All right, so I'll just give you a little overview, and this will hopefully help illustrate more some of these points. This isn't just genographic doing this business. That's Therese Markow. She was at Arizona State University, worked on Drosophila, so she was a geneticist working on non-human organisms. Never had really worked with humans. Wanted to study schizophrenia, decided she wanted to study schizophrenia among the Havasupai. Now the Havasupai live at the base of the Grand Canyon. They're the only tribe down there. You hike in and hike out, or you take a helicopter down there. So they're pretty remote. As remote as it gets, although a lot of people down there. So back in the 1990s, teamed up with a cultural anthropologist at Arizona State University. I was actually teaching at ASU before this case got settled, and so it was really interesting to be there at that time. When she teamed up with this sociocultural anthropologist, he had taken genealogies, so family histories from the Havasupai, and been doing that for about 25 years, and that really helps you by doing genetic research if you have a good genealogy. So she floated this idea of doing schizophrenia research, and he said, you know, that's stigmatizing. I don't think so. Or it might take you a while to figure out how to do that, because schizophrenia itself as a condition is stigmatizing. In order to study schizophrenia, you have to study consanguinity or inbreeding. That's stigmatizing. So why don't we think about diabetes research? We've got epidemic rates of diabetes. Tribes have quite often in the United States been willing to engage in genetic research if it's on a health condition where they feel like there might be some beneficial outcome for them. So they got institutional review board approval to do this project. So there's a big 300-page investigative report that basically shows, things are a little unclear, but it's pretty damning of what happened in this project. It shows that informed consent was inadequate at best, that people in the tribe understood themselves to be participating in a diabetes research project. They were not willing to do the schizophrenia research. She, in the meantime, got a grant to do schizophrenia research. ASU Institutional Review Board had access to all of these documents and should have seen a discrepancy between what was being agreed to by the tribe and what was actually being pursued on a research front, but they didn't for some reason catch this or think it was a problem. And for those of you that are familiar with this, informed consent has become much more rigorous in the last 10 to 15 years. So early 1990s, things were a little bit, looser back then. The only way that the tribe found out that the schizophrenia research was going on was Carletta Toulouse was doing a master's at Arizona State University at the time. She's a tribal member down at the bottom, I think in justice studies. She just happened to hear that there was a dissertation defense going on, and Havasupai were the subject of it. She went to the dissertation defense. It was open to the campus. She had given blood. Her family had given blood. And she found out what was really happening, and all hell broke loose. Can you imagine being this poor graduate student at this dissertation defense? So his advisor is there, Therese Markow. The tribal person is there. The press gets involved. It's a big scandal. 2 lawsuits are filed. 52 individual members of the tribe sued the Arizona Board of Regents, and the tribe and 52 individual members collectively sued the Arizona Board of Regents for $75 million. They charged them with doing research with inadequate informed consent. There were charges that they were rifling through Indian Health Service medical records after hours. You wouldn't get permission to look at those records anyway, but especially going through them after hours and not even trying to go through that process. Charges, and they did do this, and this has been common practice. The scientists and the grad students involved were distributing DNA samples and data to other researchers at other institutions who were working on human migrations research. And the tribe says, we never agreed to this, we're not interested in this, we come from the Grand Canyon. So the reason I talk about this case is there are sort of multiple problems with it that occur individually in other kinds of research projects as well. So even though this looks like an egregious example, it's not like these kinds of things haven't also happened, perhaps in less severe ways, among other researchers. So I don't mean to demonize Therese Markow and her group, it's just kind of all this stuff came together in this particular project. There are multiple publications listed at the end of this investigative report that show how much work, how many publications were accrued by different scientists at different institutions based on these DNA samples without explicit consent that they be used for migrations research. And if this tribe is particularly opposed to migrations research, not all tribes are. So again, I'll go back to, Therese Markow said, knowledge is power. The more one knows, the better off one is from a research perspective. Throughout this entire scandal, I have never seen one word from her of apology. You know, and it's not as if, I do have a little bit of sympathy for her, and I actually know native geneticists who are colleagues with her and have complicated my view of her actually. And feel like she got caught up at a time when research practices and ethics were changing, and got caught up in this scandal. But there has never been anything forthcoming for that said, look, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Throughout this scandal, she has vehemently defended herself. And these kinds of practices, we own the DNA, we have the right to do with it. Knowledge trumps everything. That's what's come out of this. I guess that's one of the points I want to make. Again, we have the right to your biological resource because knowledge is the greater good. It doesn't matter if you object to that particular form of knowledge, or if you're going to get nothing from it, because the greater good trumps all of that. They settled out of court, by the way, for a paltry amount of money. So, how much time do I have?
11 minutes.
Oh, okay, I better hurry up. So this is maybe less interesting to this audience. No? How do I get from DNA to blood? From blood to DNA, yeah. Let me go back to my notes and see what kinds of links I was making. Let's see. Well, let me just start in and see where I go. So basically I've got some bullet points from a very interesting study by a legal scholar, Kirsty Coker. This is not Kevin Coker, who's a very famous Native American law scholar, now head of the National Museum of the American Indian. This is Kirsty Coker, who's a young legal scholar from New Zealand of all places, who did this fantastic study of 330 tribal constitutions. And she looked at the transformation of tribal enrollment criteria in the 20th century. I have been looking from here, I've been making a lot of the same assertions she makes about the meanings of Indian blood for about 10 years, but I really didn't have any empirical data other than my own life lived on multiple reservations and working in Indian country. So I was really happy that she did this study of 330 tribal constitutions. Basically what she documents is an interesting transformation from using the racial category of Indian blood, which was imposed by the feds, or an idea constituted by federal intervention in indigenous life in the US, to the use of tribal-specific blood and tribal genealogies in the late 20th century. Now, the reason that I got interested in this kind of discussion is because in Native American studies and in race scholarship in the US, academics are always, many of us Native, are always going on and on about how tribes are brainwashed by 19th century antiquated ideas about blood. And we're biologically essentialists, and that's why we use Indian blood, and we should be using cultural criteria, and we should be using citizenship and residency and all this. We should be doing citizenship that way, not according to any of these outmoded 19th century racial ideas. We're just self-colonizing. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Now, I know that that's what academics say, oh, it's more complicated than that, but this helps explain how. And then the reason that I got interested in this argument is because tribes are beginning, I'll go through this, tribes are beginning to use DNA testing for enrollment, and I think that's worse than blood. So that's why I got interested in this, actually. Is that clear? Okay. All right. So pre-1940, about 44% of tribes had blood rules. 37% of those was Indian blood. Now, when I say Indian blood, for example, my great-grandmother was from Turtle Mountain, Chippewa. She married my great-grandfather, and in 1923, she moved to the Flanders Santee Sioux Reservation in eastern South Dakota in 1941. That tribe enrolled her. No Santee, no Dakota blood, no ancestry among those people. She's Chippewa. By the way, they're our enemies, historically our arch enemies. And we still tease each other a lot. But my great-grandfather's tribe, as they did at that time, as many tribes did around the country, allowed for spouses to become enrolled in the tribe. And we academics today tend to think that's a good idea. What they did is they went on Indian blood. Now, they would actually not have enrolled her if she was non-native. They enrolled her because she was just some other tribe, and there were these dominant ideas, well, Indians as a race, they must be somehow more culturally connected, let's enroll her. Those were some of the kinds of ideas that were operating. And this is at a time when the feds had all the control over tribal enrollment. That control has largely evolved to tribes, and so in theory, we have a lot of control over those rules today. Okay, so that's pre-1940. Today, Kirsty Coker found 70% of tribes are using blood quantum, with 40% using Indian blood. So we see more tribes using this concept of blood quantum, but a smaller percentage using the concept of Indian blood, which is that big kind of racial category. What tribes are increasingly doing is adopting tribe-specific blood rules. So to give you another example, the tribe where I'm enrolled, Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate, will enroll me. What do we have? Is it 1/4? It's 1/4. 1/4 Indian blood with a trace to the Sisseton-Wahpeton base roll. So there's a genealogical thing going on there, where maybe 50 years ago they would have enrolled me just because I had Indian blood. I could have been Navajo and married to a person in the tribe. They might have enrolled me because this idea of race was operating. Today it's this kind of genealogical trace, this tribal genealogy that's becoming more important. And so they require me, even though I've got ancestry among Turtle Mountain people, Cheyenne Arapaho people, Flanders Santee Sioux people, less ancestry at Sisseton-Wahpeton actually. It's the least of all the tribes that I'm related to. That's where I'm enrolled. It's where I've happened to spend more time. So for me, there's a cultural impetus, but they don't care about how much time I spend there. They don't care if I've ever been there. All that matters is that I can trace my lineage to the base roll, and that I have 1/4 Indian blood according to all this documentation that I have. So that's just to illustrate what this genealogical difference is from this racial difference. One of the things Gover argues is that tribes went through this transition in the 19th century, increasingly adopting blood quantum rules, not just because they're conditioned by dominant racial ideas that anthropologists and federal Indian agents put on them, but there was a lot of demographic discontinuity in the mid-20th century. We had relocation policy. We got a lot of natives in the Bay Area from other parts of the country. There's a lot of people here who aren't California Indians. Their parents and grandparents came out during relocation. You got a one-way bus ticket, right, and an apartment and a lead on a job. The idea was Indians would assimilate if they got off the res. So that's relocation. You had termination of tribes. You had World War II, so you had Native people, like women, actually getting employment opportunities they never had before World War II when all the guys went overseas, and you had Native men enrolling in the military in record numbers. We have the highest rates of military, we join in the highest rates of any demographic group. So all of these demographic shifts happening, tribes had to, I think of them as like a little skinny basketball player trying to get around this big formidable opponent. They had to come up with ways to repair the discontinuity in their tribal membership, and that's also partly what prompted the move to different kinds of rules. So we no longer did adoptions. We no longer required people to be resident because we had so many people moving far away from home. Instead, we began to say, well, if you can trace your lineage to the base roll, so we have these very complicated kinds of constellations of rules where tribes are attempting to piece together, attempting to keep their numbers manageable. So what she basically says, Kirsty Coker, is that the move to tribal blood away from federal Indian blood, this racial category, attempts to repair discontinuity wrought by both federal policy and demographic changes. And this is where we are today. You basically see lineal descent to that base roll coupled with tribal descent. So what I want to say about that is that, in fact, when academics accuse tribes of just having this biologically racialized thinking, in fact, we've moved away from race to tribe. Now, you can argue that tribe is another form of race, but it's a little bit more nuanced than just saying that tribes are enrolling based on these kinds of dominant ideas of race. I'm gonna skip over that slide. Oh, I don't know why that was in there. That's pretty funny. Has anybody heard of seen the Secret Asian Man cartoons? This guy's hysterical. Look him up online. He's got all of these really interesting cultural commentaries from the point of view of I assume a slick little hipster Asian American guy. His name is Toyoshima. That one's pretty funny. There's a DNA test that actually gives you a percentage back like this, and the thing is, the DNA test has a really hard time telling Native American from East Asia. I don't know if that's what he's getting at with that. So just really quickly, this slide is about the DNA profile. I talked a little bit about genetic ancestry testing, which is basically those maps showing the movement of markers around the world. So geneticists and anthropologists have been tracing the history of human migrations around the world. When did that happen? How long ago did that happen? How can we look at genetic markers and tell which populations and which parts of the world are related to whom? How far back in time they share ancestors and on what continents? That's all coming out of academic research, is now being commercialized in the form of genetic ancestry testing. So this is the previous slides I'm talking about. The Genographic Project sells these ancestry DNA tests, and you can, swab your cheeks, send the swab in, and they'll send you back test results saying your mitochondrial DNA traces to haplogroup A in the Americas, or your mitochondrial DNA, that's your mother's line, traces to this particular region of Northern Europe, or your Y chromosome, your father's ancestry, traces to this particular part of the world. Those kinds of tests that Genographic and other companies are selling online, genetic ancestry tests, are different than the DNA profile. This is what tribes are using for enrollment. So, there's a lot of confusion out there, even among tribes who use DNA testing for enrollment. I've talked to tribal enrollment officers. They don't understand the difference between the DNA profile or fingerprint, as it's sometimes called, and the genetic ancestry tests that are being sold online by companies like Genographic, Family Tree DNA, and Gene Tree. Those ones are looking at ancient ancestry in certain parts of the world, attaching ethnic and racial kinds of monikers to that ancestry, so that cartoon you saw, you could say, oh, I've got 27% Asian ancestry, 11% European, whatever. This is really different. This kind of DNA analysis is basically a paternity test. It's what we know as a paternity test. It's the kinds of forensic DNA that's used in, so for example, in criminal cases, to tie a bodily fluid found at a crime scene to a alleged perpetrator. Tribes are using DNA profiles basically to prove that a child is the biological offspring of a parent who's trying to enroll them. That's all it is. It's not about Native American DNA, it's just a paternity or a maternity test. And then when they prove that child is the biological offspring, they can then use all of that other historical documentation to tie that child to the base role. But when I speak to tribal enrollment officers, sometimes they think that what they're looking at is Native American DNA. And so they've got these ideas about race and genetics informing their interpretation of this test. And this test has nothing to do with that kind of ancestry. This is like looking at your finger, are you who you say you are? And is that your mother and is that your father? And therefore can we enroll you in this tribe? Sorry, I didn't save enough time to talk about this, but just keep in mind there's two kinds of DNA analyses out there that people are using to think about Native American identity and enrollment. Skip over that.
Could we pause there?
Yep, we can pause here.
I'm going to make much of this claim on the right in my talk, so take just 5 seconds to read what it says about the truth is in the DNA.
Do you want me to read it out loud? Can everybody see it? Okay. The truth is in the DNA. With an ORCID DNA test, determining Native American lineage for tribal enrollment is fast, simple, and non-invasive. ORCID provides irrefutable results through scientific assessment of alleged biological relationships. Contact ORCID for information on routine paternity tests or more complex patrilineage, matrilineage, and kinship analyses. So what ORCID is selling to tribes is the DNA fingerprint or the DNA profile. Now they do also sell those genetic ancestry tests that look at ancient migrations and your ancient ancestry in certain parts of the world. But what they have been peddling to tribes at meetings like the National Congress of American Indians, they always have a table. They always have a table at NIGA, the National Indian Gaming Association. The geneticists are out at national tribal meetings where wealthy, especially wealthy gaming tribes have money. And this is the other thing to mention, I know I'm about at my time here. When I started doing this work, I thought DNA testing and the way we're fetishizing race and DNA was the problem. In relation to tribal enrollment, the only reason that this stuff kicks in is where tribes are trying to keep their rolls small because they're paying out monthly payments to members known as per capita payments. When per capita payments happen, tribes get deluged with enrollment applications and then they turn to DNA to try and cut down the documentary work that they have to do to keep their rolls small. For tribes that do engage in gaming or other economic activities that don't distribute money on a monthly basis to members, they do not have the level of enrollment controversy. So my tribe has 3 moderately profitable casinos. We don't do per caps. We don't have a bunch of people trying to get into our tribe. We only use these on an occasional case-by-case basis when paternity is in doubt. We also accept affidavits. So 3 members of the family can sign a piece of paper saying that little kid is my grandkid, my niece, my nephew, and we will enroll them. A wealthy casino tribe that's distributing money every month to each individual member will not accept an affidavit. But I think what Troy's alluding to is there's really interesting kind of imagery going on here with conflating Native American identity with genetics, and we can probably get to that in his comments and in the discussion. So I'm going to stop there to leave Troy enough time.
To adjudicate identity in a category. So 20 years ago, that wasn't even considered. But currently, what's happening more and more around the world is the use of DNA to trump lived experience. Now, here's a couple of examples. Spencer Wells and the project that she described. You don't need this on. In Spencer Wells' project, he gets DNA from people and he tells them they're going to trace their ancestry. He took a woman who was a Canadian, Native American, they call First Nations people in Canada, and he gave her back the DNA analysis from the mitochondrial side, and said that she was actually, she had been working and living in a group as an advocate for their legal, social issues. He gets her DNA and gives it back to her and says that, no, you're not in that tribe where she'd been enrolled and spending much of her life. You're in Tribe B. Now, Tribe B was a group that she had been in an adversarial role with for the previous 10 years. So now imagine the, quote, damage that's being done when the DNA adjudicates lived experience. She's been in the role of a legal advocate, but she's now told by science she's part of Tribe B that she's been fighting, not Tribe A. Now, this is happening increasingly. So, let's see. DNA tells students who they really are, not who they thought they were. So you've been living for 10, 20 years in a particular category, and now the DNA test comes back and says, you're not exactly what you were. I'm going to just skip over this because I think the issue is how we begin to scientize categorical membership. So, now we have these tests, which Kim alluded to, which tells you what % background. Skip Gates did this program with PBS about 5 years ago, which he tells people, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, he tells her that she's not really Native American at all. And he tells, based upon the DNA, he tells Oprah she's not really Zulu, and she starts crying. He tells several people that they thought that they had ancestry Native American, but the test says no. Now, these are all relatively educated people. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot is a professor at Harvard. Listen to the name, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. And he tells her the DNA test says she has no Native American background. And Sarah nods in assent on national television, doesn't challenge it, and leaves the audience with the impression that these tests are definitive. Now, as Kim indicated, when money is involved, everything changes. So the Seminoles had this $1 million payment out 30 to 40 years ago, and the question was now, well, who's a Seminole? Well, go back to Kim's remarks about the 19th century. 19th century, you wanted to expand the number of blacks, right? That was the one-drop rule. So if you're anything that was black in your background, you were black. But you wanted to constrict Native Americans because you wanted their land. So now the question in the 19th century, with this 1876 ruling, I think it is, whatever the blood quantum ruling is, what's the name of that ruling? You know?
I've stayed away from this topic.
Okay. It's on the books as determining whether or not you are a Native American or not. And what it does is to constrict your membership as opposed to the one-drop rule, which would have expanded. So that's the part I really wanted to emphasize here. Now, when we move to that slide, let me see, we have a what's it called?
Pointer.
Pointer?
Sorry, I didn't bring.
Okay, we don't need one. All right, this is a slide from a colleague of mine, Steve Olsen. And you can see, he claims, because Iceland has such a good record, he claims he goes back 10 generations. That means he can go back in the record book and find that all these people back to Eric, they were fathers, 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 fathers. Y chromosome analysis could do the same thing. He claims he can go back only 4 generations on the mother's side. Mitochondrial will take you back as far as all the way back 10 generations if you have the mitochondrial DNA. Now, here's what's interesting. Why do we claim we go back 10 generations on the male side? Because we have records from a patrilineal society. That's because of social, cultural, legal issues, not DNA, not genomics. We only go back 4 generations because that's as far as the Icelandic population kept records. It was a patrilineal society. However, what's true about this graphic, which people often don't really understand, is that each of these people at these levels contribute equally to the DNA of Steve Olsen. So he had 2 parents, 23 chromosomes each, 4 grandparents, diluted 1/4, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. In other words, all of these people contribute equally to Steve Olsen. Why do we think that this is his lineage? Genetically, that's nonsense. Socioculturally, politically, that's inheritance lines. Father's father's father. What's it called? Primogeniture. When the father lets the son inherit the land. Now that's Western civilization. And that's sociocultural, not genetic. All right? So when he said he goes back 10 generations, he means socioculturally. All these people contribute equally to Steve Olsen. Now that's true for Steve Olsen. It's true for every person in this room. It's true for every Native American. It's true for everybody. In other words, you can't take your mitochondrial DNA or your Y chromosome. That's what these things are. Y chromosome is father's father's line. This is how, by the way, they got Thomas Jefferson linked up with Sally Hemings. The Y chromosome is pretty determinative. And they found out that the Jefferson boys, one of them, must have been linked with the Hemings girl. Mitochondrial is how Mary Claire King, over in genetics, linked up the offspring of the disappeared in Argentina with the grandchildren. So there were 20,000 disappeared in Argentina. Mary Claire goes down to Buenos Aires, gets the DNA of the offspring, traces the mitochondrial back to the grandmothers, and links up these people. So it's true. Mitochondrial and Y chromosome analysis are fairly definitive. After that, it's all smoke and mirrors. What do I mean? What Ken was talking about was something called ancestry informative markers. If you don't have either Y chromosome or the mitochondria, then what you do is you take some group of people, let's say 500, 1,000, 2,000, from around an area, let's say they're all Native Americans, or all Europeans, or all blacks, and you stir up their DNA in a machine, and you come up with something called ancestry informative markers. Now what are those? there is no marker among humans that is distinctive to any population. Okay? There's nothing called a marker that's only among Europeans, among Africans, or among Native Americans. It's frequency of the occurrence of the marker that we're talking about. We're talking about markers or groups. So what happens is that they have an arbitrary number of so many thousand people. Then they claim that this particular machine will do an analysis at what's called 40% of the markers which are distinctive, and then claim that that becomes the 100%. Now what do I mean? How do we get someone being 67% white? How do we get there? Well, you have to have a list of 100% white, right? How do we get 12% Native American? There must be 100% Native American, right? I mean, that's basic logic. You can't have a percent without 100%. So what do they mean? They're using ancestry informative markers in this arbitrary way that collapses the whole notion of who is 100% Native American. 100% black. Stephen Colbert was told by Skip Gates he's 100% white. And Colbert, who's a comedian, nodded cautiously, that must be true. Sarah Lord Lightfoot was told she was not 1% Native American. That would require that Skip Gates and the geneticists have a notion of a complete and total 100% pure Native American. That's a fiction of a statistical program that's drawing markers from an arbitrary group, each with 4 grandparents that are, of course, not in any sense pure, as Kim just told you. In all of her examples, she talks about how the Native Americans have cross-links. So why do we think that there is anything called 100%? Well, it's because these companies, I guess I'm out of time too, these companies have it in their interest to push these tests, which tell you whether you're really Native American, or what tribe you're really from. What's happening with pharmaceuticals, what's happening in other parts of the world with forensics and DNA, that these tests and test takers are coming to use a kind of reified notion that the DNA is the adjudicator of group membership. When upon closer inspection, if you understand the science of genetics, what's happening with the arbitrary use of categories, this is deeply flawed. Let me close with one example. There's a genetic disease among French Canadians that's relatively common. And it's often traced by geneticists who have no anthropology training to a founder effect. They say that once upon a time, the French came over, they were all French and therefore all purely French. And they procreated and produced this population with a particular vulnerability to this genetic disease. And that's been going on for the last 10, 15 years. Anthropologists and demographers went back into the record books. And they showed that that's a flawed notion. Why? Because in the 1780s, the French who came to Canada wanted to have more and more of their population, expansion as opposed to contraction. And so they converted some Native Americans to Christianity and often married them. So now what we thought was, quote, the pure French population is, upon closer inspection anthropologically, demographically, in no sense pure. It was Christianized. They took the other names, the British of people's names, became Christian names. And on the books, it looks like these are French people. In fact, they were, quote, First Nations. And yet we have these tests. That's why I mentioned Orchard. We're going to tell you who you are based upon what? Not the lived experience. 3 years ago, front page story in the New York Times. African male is in the U.S. He's a widower. He's got 4 kids. One is with him. He wants to bring the other 3 from Africa. The immigration services say DNA test, because we don't want anybody coming in here that's just plain. Now the story takes a bizarre turn. The DNA test, remember he's a widower. Now his wife is dead. The 3 children that are still in Africa are not linked to him on the Y chromosome. Paternity test said they're not his. And so the government of the United States declined to permit him to have his children join him in the U.S. because of the DNA test. Now, I closed where I opened. What's happened in this case is that the lived experience of being a father is now trumped by the DNA adjudicating membership in the category called family. Right? This person has been raising these kids for the last 15 years. They're his kids, socio-culturally, politically, legally. But the DNA test says they are not his kids. And the government decides he cannot bring them into the country. So that, I think, is the import of the kind of analysis that Kim is bringing to this. We've moved from the 19th century notion of blood quantity to a kind of arbitrary sense that what's going on here is science. When upon closer inspection, the science has deeply problematic underpinnings.
I'd like to introduce the chair of our center, Joseph Myers. Joe, do you want to make a comment or ask the first question, or say anything?
First question.
All right.
Sorry, I was a bit late. I come from Santa Rosa, and the traffic is monstrous. One question that, well, first, it's kind of a statement. There are those of us who are born to teenage moms. A lot of us on reservations born to teenage moms, and we have no indication who our fathers are. That's me. The only time I had a outpouring of affection from a few guys was when I graduated from high school as a class valedictorian and captain of the football team and so forth. I had 4 or 5 guys that said, "You're my son." And that soon disappeared. There was no support. But my mother never told me who my father was. So immediately, you don't have the 4, you've got 2. And it was a very good upbringing with my maternal grandparents. I loved them both, and they took care of me in terms of the work ethic and discipline and so forth. We have today a situation with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, where the scientists, not all scientists and not all anthropologists and archaeologists feel this way, but some look at the split between ancient societies and the modern tribes who are making claims to what scientists believe are ancient remains and should be solely and exclusively the possessory interests of science and not of the modern day tribes. So what do you think of that? Do you think that repatriation ought to include ancient remains or not?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, I actually stay away from nature issues too a little bit, just because there's so many other people working on them. I had a couple of thoughts. The first thing is that NAGPRIT is not, I've actually noticed there's a big difference, I think, between scientists who came up intellectually pre-NAGPRIT and younger scientists who came up intellectually post-NAGPRIT. A lot of the critical scientists, and I work with critical scientists on collaborative projects, they tend to be under the age of 45. Many of them are women, although not exclusively. NAGPRIT is a fact of life for them, and they figure out how to work collaboratively. They are thinking critically about who has the property interest in the DNA. So there's a geneticist up in Canada named Laura Arbor who has this DNA on loan concept, where the property interest stays with the donor. The scientist, it's much more cumbersome to do research like this though, right? You don't get to come in as a scientist, get access to the bones of the DNA and say it's mine forever. You know, it's removed from your body, or this person is dead, therefore there's no informed consent, they're not human anymore. So in one sense, those things are easier to deal with if you're working with a younger set, and not exclusively, but many younger critical scientists. So that's kind of what I tend to focus on. The other thing, though, this is getting into a little bit more philosophical territory. There's this idea, and this is where I try to intervene in some of my intellectual work, that science has the right to adjudicate all of these decisions. And one of the things that has happened by the cutting off of religion from the state, our efforts to separate state and religion in this country, is that science has taken the place of religion. And science is welded onto this. In order to have a legitimate voice at the policy-making table, you have to be doing rational decision-making, science-based decision-making. And so there is this sense in which scientists who want to make claims to remains in DNA, they're coming out of a cultural purview where they feel like, of course our right to produce knowledge trumps everything else. This is rational. These people are superstitious. They shouldn't have the same place at the table as us. There's a philosopher that used to work at Berkeley who is quite polemical. What's his name? Somebody help me out here. I teach Fire Robbins. He's a polemical, but I like what he has to say. He basically talked about that. He basically proposed that that scientists are an interest group. And they have a particular set of interests, and those are something they should have a voice at this table, but so should clergy, so should Native Americans, so should everybody else. They don't get a special place at the table as the voice of rationality and reason, and then all these other people just have cultural interests, and he was making that. So for me, I sort of, this science is really interesting to me, and I think they should have a voice in the debate. I don't think that scientific knowledge production gets to trump everything else. That's the rationale that missionaries used in the 19th century. You know, Christianity trumped everything. It was so tightly wed to the civilizational project. Christianity's not anymore. Science is now wed to the civilizational project. And for me, I see clear parallels between Christian missionizing in the 19th century and scientific missionizing now. And just like I wouldn't throw Christianity out, there's some great things about it, I wouldn't throw science out. But I don't think science should be the whole sphere and everything else is just, I don't know if that's an answer to your question. So I don't have any policy recommendations, but yeah.
Anyone else?
I just have a science question.
And you know I'm not a scientist and a social
Troy, you together will probably be able to answer this question. Because it's just one of which shows ignorance, really. Is it possible sometime in the future, etc., to excavate something from one of these caves that you read about in New York Times with DNA in such a way that a marker, like with Troy and you were alluding to, that a DNA marker for something pure could exist?
Something pure?
Yeah, no, in other words, she talks about something that's isolated, some marker, something that's isolated where you did, or whatever group it was not at all, did not miscegenate with any other group. Is that possible?
Well, you know the Neanderthal controversy, right?
No, I don't. I mean, that's why I'm asking.
Okay.
I don't know.
So, yeah, it is possible, or the claim is made, that we can now go into the DNA of particular fossils and determine that there was a Neanderthal and not Homo sapien. If that's what you mean, the answer is yes.
I don't know what I meant exactly. I guess I'm thinking something like this.
A people-specific marker.
Yeah, could one imagine going back far enough? I mean,
The further back you go, you'd have to have a population of relevance to determine that was that pure population. Understand?
I think so. I'm not sure.
You need a big campground.
You need a big campground. You have a number of people say this is a pure population. They did not intermingle with other populations. How do you know that? You'd have to have other populations that were distinctive to know that. So you couldn't find one person who was, quote, distinctive unless you understood the population that's relevant of, quote, purity.
So you couldn't start with one and then see where that trail went down.
You could see, but I don't see what you'd get by it unless you could figure out it was a pure population.
The young lady, you had your hand up there a minute ago.
I don't know that it's a question, but I was thinking about the Skip Gates project and especially the part where there's a number of interviewees who are Black identified, and they sort of talk about like these mythologies with this connection with Native folk, and like this kind of, there's like a relational mythology. And then Skip is like, actually, you're not at all related to these people. And for me, the mythology became a way to metabolize oppression and a way to deal with, and the way to sort of create coalitional politics among people of color. And sort of, I mean, I guess, I don't know, I don't have a question, but I feel like if you have if anything comes up
like
here
he
around that.
undermined that with his genetically
Yeah,
authoritative voice.
yeah, and like,
Yeah,
what's
sure.
the project of that? Like, I mean, why would you want to do that? That was kind of, and you know, I have weird feelings about Skip Gates, but.
Well, you have to like do a psychological study of Skip Gates.
She raises the issue, the freedmen's and the Cherokee controversy that's ongoing. There's a treaty right involved with the United States. The former slaves were made members of the Cherokee
They were
Nation.
naturalized as members of the Cherokee Nation.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so and somebody jump in if you want. I mean, I follow this and I'm interested because it brings in concepts of sovereignty and concepts of race. And from my perspective, you've got people in the tribe touting sovereignty, you've got a lot of African American constituencies looking at race. Neither group, from my point of view, understands in a really sophisticated way the intersections of sovereignty and race that are shaping this problem historically, and you need to understand both. So the Cherokee, I don't know when the treaty was, but Cherokee Nation had a treaty with the US government, part of which naturalized the freed slaves and the descendants of freed slaves as part of the Cherokee Nation. But what they did was they constructed two rolls. They had the blood rolls, so those who were biologically related to Cherokees, and then they had the freedmen rolls, those who were naturalized citizens, the descendants of freedmen. Today, there have been efforts, right, to disenroll the people on the freedmen rolls. And again, I think it has to do with money, but I don't know what that issue is. So there are arguments being made by the tribe that, look, this was forced upon us in this treaty. The US, by the way, has violated every other provision of this treaty, so why are they sort of using this as a trump card to call us racist and make us uphold it? You know, if you want to uphold it, give us back Oklahoma, because that's also part of that treaty. Right? And so let me finish because I have kind of stayed away from this. From the other side, and I've been at meetings at National Congress of American Indians where this has been brought up, people are saying to the Cherokee Nation, look, you need to deal with the way that histories of race in the South have shaped what the Cherokee Nation looks like. It is true that Cherokee Nation leadership codes as white for a lot of people. And that's got a lot to do with how, again, remember how Native Americans have been racialized differently in relation to whiteness than the way blacks have been racialized. You can imagine in the South, if you're African American, you're not going to be intermarrying with whites in the same way that Native Americans are intermarrying. So you probably are going to get fewer African Americans also intermarrying with Native Americans, and fewer African Americans actually being descended from the blood rolls and the freedmen rolls. There are people that are descended from both, and Cherokee Nation is paying for the genealogical work for African American descendants to show that they're related to the blood rolls. But there's still this other thing going on. And so there are these histories of the way that blacks have been disenfranchised in the South, that have kind of excluded them historically from the Cherokee Nation, but there's also this treaty history going on, and it seems to me that we need to understand both in order to sort. It's a very complicated situation, and there are claims about sovereignty that are legitimate, but there are also claims about black disenfranchisement that are legitimate, and these things are kind of butting up against each other in this issue. Yeah.
The thing that disturbs me most about that is that the United States government is the one who then made the determination, which takes sovereignty away from Native people being able to determine how they're going to enroll people in their tribe. If the United States government then steps in the freedmen case, which they have, and says you have to keep these people enrolled, it takes the decision making back out of the hands of Native tribes themselves.
Right.
So it's a sovereignty issue.
Well,
And it's happening a lot in California because of, like you said, because of per diem payments and disenrollment and small tribes that are, disenrolling family members and cousins and stuff.
Okay,
It's disturbing.
one more question.
So I would like to return to the issue about population and the abstraction of a population that geneticists are using. And as we heard, I think it is an abstraction and not something concrete, but something that geneticists need to use in certain concepts, in certain situations. For example, if you want to map type 2 diabetes, to do the statistical analysis right, you need to invent the idea about a population. Now, that raises in the problem, so I think all of us can agree if that's what it is for, then there's no problem with it. But of course, they're a private company that wants to exploit our sort of people's willingness to want to categorize everything, and therefore what they exploit these sort of statistical concepts to reinforce some stereotypes and of course to categorize people and maybe falsely allow people to categorize, help them to categorize themselves. And this again raised another issue whether the problem here really is are the geneticists and the scientists, or the perception of their work in the public. There's a strong belief, I think, in our society in biological determinism, especially in genetic determinism that weights, especially in America. And of course, the work of geneticists is interpreted both by everybody in our societies in the context of those beliefs. So I would argue that well, my question is if you would agree with that. In many cases, the geneticists, and in this relation to the last speaker, are doing reasonable work and consensus work, but it's the public perception of that work that's damaging, not so much the geneticist work. And it's as well as being accepted, not being a scientist.
I understand the question. There's a great paper by Fujimori and on this topic. What's the population of geneticists? And of course, it varies depending on the question. The problem is that while it's obviously and transparently arbitrary in some ways why the population was chosen, when the results come out, the geneticists themselves, in some important ways, reify the outcome. They give it a kind of reality that you wouldn't expect from the arbitrary character of the original population parameters. That's why I use the French-Canadian example. That when the results come out, this founder population explains this particular gene disorder among the French Canadians. But in fact, that's not the case. But you'd have to know a little bit about anthropology, demography, Christianity, 18th century, in order to understand that. And geneticists, of course, are not trained to do that. And indeed, when I talk to geneticists about this, they tend to say things like, that's not our department. We're looking at the DNA. And I say, what about the taxonomic system in which the population came? That takes them into a whole other arena, which of course is very difficult.
But I mean,
Okay, we're past 1:30, and so we're going to have to conclude, so you can continue that in the green room, as they say in Belgium. Thank you very much.